Right now, we're going to have some content. We want to talk about theologically and practically, what do we mean when we say the word peacemaking, and how does that inform how we engage any border in our lives, whether it's relational or socioeconomic or a geographic one like we have here at this border. And then we'll be moving into conversation. Again, as much of an immersion as we can have virtually. We'll be meeting with Border Patrol agents who we've built a relationship with for years. Many of the folks like Yolanda that I just mentioned. We'll be hearing from legal experts, and we're going to be doing some workshopping ourselves. How are we building our capacity, the tools to cross any border that divides us? So looking forward to that together. It's going to be good, and I hope you can keep your energy up and your minds sharp so we can engage not only with head, but with heart throughout this day. For me, as in the introduction, Bishop Susan mentioned a little bit of my context. I co-founded an organization called Global Immersion, having been a pastor for my whole adult life. And the work of Global Immersion, it was really founded in saying, hey, the Church of the United States, at least, has really been incompetent in our theological and practical capacity for peacemaking. We understand peacemaking is central to our vocation as followers of Jesus, but we don't know how to talk about it theologically or practically. In fact, many times what we've seen internationally is that the U.S. and the church is either complicit in violence or perpetuating violence rather than taking seriously our invitation to be instruments of peace. So our work is to train largely pastors and leaders and everyday followers of Jesus in a theology and practice for peace and peacemaking. I have 4 little kiddos where we try to live this stuff out in our own context, my wife and I, a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 5-year-old. And I'll open by sharing a story. My oldest, when she was graduating from preschool, she was invited. Here's my kiddos here, 10 on the left, and I have twins, 5-year-olds, Hank and Lou, and then a 7-year-old Rosie in there. The oldest, Ruby, was graduating from preschool, and what she understands of me is that Daddy teaches peacemaking. That's my job, which is largely true. And so it was career day for her preschool, and she was so excited. She came home and said, "Dad, it's career day. Will you come and talk to the kids about peacemaking?" And I'm like, of course I'm going to say yes, but inside I'm like, oh my gosh, it's hard enough to explain peacemaking to 40-year-olds, let alone 5-year-olds. And I said yes and decided to go in there. And of course I come right after the cook and the cop, 2 jobs that are pretty clear as to what they do. And so Ruby then goes up to the stage and kind of bashfully, but with great pride, says, "Here's my daddy. He's a peacemaker." And I come up and like, "Yeah, I'm a peacemaker." And all the kids in unison yell, "He's a pizza maker." and I immediately realized this is going to be one of the hardest speaking gigs of my life. And so I turn on the creative game and get the kids on the stage to begin to act out what peacemaking might look like. What does it mean when someone's feeling isolated or lonely? And what is it? How do we make sure everyone feels included? Or this person took something for me. What's our response? And the kids are engaging in it. I'm thinking maybe they were getting it. Maybe they're understanding what peacemaking is. And so we finish up, and I'm walking out the back door, and this little bro comes up to me and whispers in my ear, "I like pepperoni." And I realized, yet again, all the years I've been talking about peacemaking, it is so hard to grasp and to understand in the ears of a 5-year-old, and then oftentimes, again, in the ears of those of us in adulthood. And I want to articulate the imperative, the importance of this, and how often it gets displaced, because we all feel this moment. Whether we're in the US or we're in Central America, we understand that this is a conflicted moment. Our presumption is that conflict is not the problem. It's our inability to navigate it well, to have tools to navigate it well. So while 5-year-olds might struggle to understand peacemaking, I think we can often struggle, especially in Bishop Curry's word, to make it practical. We have to make peacemaking, or as he said, we have to make love practical. And that's our invitation today. I'll never forget meeting a Christian Palestinian man in Jerusalem. I was studying in Jerusalem as part of my seminary studies. And I was there to study the historical context of Jesus. I love that academic-y, geeky stuff. And I was there with my wife. She was 7 months pregnant at the time. And we're in Jericho and Bethlehem and Jerusalem studying these holy sites. The Bible's coming alive. But I hadn't woken up to the reality of many people who were living the Jesus story, living that ancient story in the modern context, and inviting me to wake up to the ways that God's good news was still being made real. Well, it happened in this hotel room, in the hotel. We're going through our buffet line every morning, and this gentleman we'd catch eyes with, we'd say hello. One day he asked my wife, "How far along are you?" Because obviously she was showing at 7 months. She says 7 months. He widens his eyes with pride, or with excitement. And he says, "My wife is also 7 months along." And there's this immediate connection. And so our connection grew each day. One day he said, "Hey, John, I get off work late tonight. You want to hang out on the rooftop and talk?" And I'm like, "Of course." So I go to the rooftop. We're in the Christian quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, overlooking Herod's palace. And we're talking about everyday life. We're talking about becoming dads. We're talking about the World Cup. And then his cadence begins to slow, and he turns and looks at me somberly, and he says, "John, why do your people think I'm a terrorist? I follow Jesus just like you do. How can you pray for your meals every morning, and 5 minutes away, your sisters and brothers in Christ are experiencing daily occupation and oppression?" He said, "I'm a Palestinian Christian. I live in the West Bank, just on the other side of that separation wall," which we could see from that rooftop. In that moment, you can imagine my worldview expands, my heart breaks. And it forced me to ask a series of questions around the gospel I had inherited. How was it that I didn't understand the implications of my theology on someone like Milad? How was it that I was a seminary trained pastor and I couldn't articulate a theology and a practiced life of peace and peacemaking? How was it his understanding of the church, the U.S. church, was complicit in his occupation rather than his liberation? These are eye-opening, conversion-like questions that led me to focus my studies and then practice in this work of peacemaking. The rest of that trip, we would get done with my Holy Land tour at 5, and my wife and I would jump on the public Arab bus, go through the military checkpoints and into the West Bank to visit Milad and his wife Manar. And what we witnessed was the gospel turning 3D. We stepped off of that bus and into their neighborhood, Bethany, historic neighborhood of Lazarus Resurrection, a town of resurrection. Well, we saw what resurrection looked like today, when these peacemakers were living and waging peace with their lives. As they walked through these dusty streets, the kids would pour out of the homes and grab a hold of them because of what they meant to that place. What we found was the reason Milad was working at the hotel we were staying at, changing our sheets and serving our meals, was to raise enough money to fund a nonprofit to teach the next generation of Palestinian kids that reconciliation is a way of life. Milad and Manar have become our mentors over the last decade, our guides. Every time I'm back in the Middle East, it's sitting at their table, oftentimes with delegations of pastors that I'll bring as part of our work, to wake up to the invitation to say yes to God's call to be peacemakers. The reality is many of us have confronted and read our text, have read the Bible in such a way that people like me, U.S. American Christians, can see ourselves, we read ourselves as the protagonist in that story. The reality is the people of God throughout the biblical story are those on the underside of power. People like Milad, people like Yolanda. So how might it be that we understand that our invitation is to follow a God who is always on has the eyes and is embodying those on the underside of power? It's an invitation of formation and discipleship. Just for the slides, you can pause the slides. We're not there yet to the seed practice. In fact, you can go back a slide. So I want us to think about what would it look like to understand that we are part of a story, of a biblical story. Many of us, again, especially in the U.S. Christian space, where we have more in common with Pharaoh than with Moses, with Pilate than with Jesus. And how are we tuning in to those like our immigrant neighbors who are following Jesus with their lives, like Milad, who's following Jesus with his life, and allowing that to shape who we are and how we are in any border that divides us. So in this moment of fear, in this culture of divide and polarizing rhetoric, it would be easy to withdraw, to retreat. Many of us maybe feel that way. We say, this is too crazy. The political elections has been too much. I'm out. Or maybe some of us are are moving at such a level where we're beginning to burn out. We're beginning to break relationships just because we want to hang on to our ideology so tightly. I want to invite us. Sheikh Ahab is a Muslim lecturer at Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's the third most holy site in all of Islam in Jerusalem. And one day I was sitting there with him with a collection of Christian pastors, and I asked him the question, how do we navigate what this disease we have in the States called Islamophobia? He looked at me and he looked at us and he says, John, he said, you need to stop hearing about us and you need to start hearing from us. What if our starting point today is to take seriously the invitation to a shared table, to start hearing about our other, whether it's our immigrant other or our political other or our theological other, and start hearing from, to close this proximity gap. Why do I have hope that peacemaking is possible? Well, the first 300 years of the church, it was normative to embrace an ethic of nonviolence. Jesus embodied it. The church followed it. We know with Constantine that in the 300s, the church got so close to power that it compromised our practice as peacemakers. But we believe there's no more important time to recapture that vocation. Biblically, we talk about God's movement throughout the biblical story towards humanity. God created, as we know in these creation poems in Genesis 1 and 2, a world that was whole, rightly ordered. We talk about the word shalom, the Hebrew word for peace. Things were as they should be. Genesis 3, humanity grabs for the fruit of power, and there's a fracture. There's a break in that story. What does God do? God doesn't set the pencil down and walk away. God continues to write the story of redemption and restoration. God makes it God's mission to restore all that was broken in Genesis 3 through the rest of that story. And God invites us to participate in it. Sarah and Abraham invited to be good news to the world, to be peacemakers who are reflective of God's restorative work. They struggle with this vocation. They bounce back and forth. The people of God struggle with this vocation. They bounce between exile and restoration. The invitation is still clear. Participate in God's mission of restoration. Be good news. Be people who are part of God's peacemaking work in our world. We see the people of God go into occupation, first with Assyria, then with Babylon, and there's silence. And the prophets begin to speak, and they say that God still sees you. God sees the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in everyone. God is going to immerse into your story. God hasn't forgotten you, into your conflict. God's going to contend for your restoration. We fast forward. Jesus is the embodiment of this. We trust that Jesus is God become human, living a life of seeing our humanity, immersing into our conflict, contending not by getting even, but getting creative in love with his life. You can pause the PowerPoint there again. I'll cue you up when we move forward. Sorry for the confusion on that. So we understand that God is a God who's moving towards us. We see in resurrection, God is restoring all things. Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 5 talks about our invitation as followers of Jesus to be reconciled to God, to understand our identity as the reconciled beloved, and to live as ambassadors or ministers of reconciliation. So it's clear to us, all the different ways that I've defined the mission of God throughout seminary and pastoring, and I'm sure we have all these different interpretations of it. What if, and this is a slide, you can go back a slide from C, restoration is the mission of God and peacemaking is a vocation of God's people. We believe that restoration is the mission of God. God's mission is to restore all that's been broken. And our vocation is to participate in that as peacemakers. There's lots of reasons we haven't taken this seriously throughout church history. There's lots of reasons why it's been not only a struggle to identify why we need to be peacemakers, but to continue to live that out. We've had theological obstacles, cultural obstacles that see peacemaking as this fairy tale. How many of us think of peacemaking and we think of the 1960s and 70s and Volkswagen buses and tie-dyed shirts? Or we think of peacemaking as impractical. It's not lived out enough around us for us to make it real in our lives. We would argue that peacemaking is the most costly, subversive way of following Jesus. I want to go back to that image of kintsugi. There was a picture of a pot, if we can go to that slide, We define peace as the holistic repair of relationship. Peace is the holistic repair of relationship. This image of kintsugi, it's a Japanese art where the artist actually builds something beautiful and then breaks it. And where the brokenness, the conflicts, the fissures once were, it's actually repaired and put back together in the places where those fractures and conflicts once were. It's sealed with seams of gold, reminding us that what was once broken is actually stronger and more beautiful than it was before the break. What if, when we navigate as everyday peacemakers through conflict, we become stronger? How many of us have navigated hard conflicts with people we love? We've actually pulled it off. We could probably look at that relationship and realize it's stronger than it was before the break. It's a gift. It's an opportunity. We don't have to be scared of conflict. We can move towards it. Okay, I want to specifically now apply that. We have 4 core practices that are going to inform the way we talk about peacemaking today. See, immerse, contend, restore, which I just briefly touched on throughout the biblical story. And I want to get practical with those in the context of immigration and the border. And again, not just this geographical border, although we will focus on that, any border that divides us socially, relationally, geographically, in our own context. The first practice of everyday peacemaking is the practice of see. And for those that are flipping sides, it should be pretty clear. We're going to go right through the practices at this point. Everyday peacemakers see the humanity, the dignity, and the image of God in everyone. This sounds like Christianity 101, but this is something that's so easy to forget, especially in a heightened culture and climate of rhetoric and polarization and stigma and stereotype. We are called to see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in everyone. The question we have to ask is, who have we been taught to see, and who have we been taught not to see? All of us have inherited a culture, a theology, a politic that has blind spots. Some of us have been taught to see certain people and taught not to see other people because they didn't fit the categories we needed them to be in within the worldview that we inherited. We have to go on a confessional journey of seeing what's broken inside of us that's getting in the way of our ability to see our other. Jean Vanier says we create enemies because we haven't confronted the enemy within us. We create enemies because we haven't done the work to confront what's broken in us. This is an introspective journey. John 4, Jesus goes out of his way into the land of Samaria to meet with a Samaritan woman, who in that context would have been seen as a second-class citizen. A woman out during the day, married multiple times, among a community who is seen as impure. Jesus moves towards that person. Doesn't assign her dignity, simply points to the dignity that was already within her, that maybe she had forgotten. He sees her. Jesus is the sight healer. He was in the Gospels, and he is today. What would it look like for us to actually see the way Jesus sees? The executioner that's putting Jesus to death, Jesus' word to him, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus even sees the humanity of the people who are putting him to death. I was raised in Salinas, California. So it's known as the lettuce capital of the world. It's an ag town. Everywhere you look, you see fields. I went to school in Castroville, the artichoke capital of the world, next to Gilroy, the garlic capital of the world. We like to self-proclaim our superiority, apparently. But through those towns, between all my stops between school and church and work, were fields. And in those fields were people bent over picking the food I was going to eat for dinner. For 2 decades, I drove through those fields and noticed those people, but I didn't see those people. I didn't see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in them. I hadn't been taught to see them. I had been taught not to see them, even as being raised a good Christian boy in the US. Maybe those were some of the biggest ways that cataracts got in my eyes. It wasn't until I moved down here to the borderlands over a decade ago and lived in a neighborhood where a majority of my neighbors are immigrants. Many are undocumented, began to understand and see the plight of the immigrant, that many of whom are farm workers. It began to help me re-examine my understanding, my privilege in my own context of Salinas, where I was raised, and apply it to what does it look like to live as a neighbor who sees here. When the kids are around our kids' birthday tables are undocumented, or their parents are undocumented, and their parents are being deported. This turns from an esoteric idea or a political talking point to a human reality of neighbor love, of flourishing. We have an invitation to see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God, not only in our immigrant neighbor, but every one of our neighbor. Maybe even in this moment, it's harder to see the humanity of those closest to us who disagree with us politically. When we recover our sight and see the way Jesus sees, we will find that immigrants and neighbors aren't problems to fix, but gifts to receive. How do we have the capacity to receive that gift and learn from it and learn from them and build relationships of mutuality? The second practice I want to invite us into is to immerse. Once we see, we're invited to step off, to immerse. Everyday peacemakers step off the road of comfort and move into reality. We move toward conflict, injustice, with tools to heal rather than to win. Peace and peacemaking is not passive. It's a proactive movement toward conflict, toward injustice. But it requires we have tools to heal, to transform, not just to win or to destroy. It transcends that fight or flight that we often default into. I'm going to run away from this conflict, it's too much. Or I'm going to run right to the center of it and sock that guy in the face, or say that word that's going to be cutting and painful. What we see in Jesus is a God who immersed into our conflict, into our broken story. A God who said, I'm not going to hang out just in the heavenlies. I'm going to immerse into the muck, into the pain, into the soil, into the beauty and the brokenness of the human story. What would it look like for us to immerse into the conflicts real to us? Oftentimes, many of us inherited a faith, a Christian faith, that said, if we move towards that person, our other, who thinks or looks or believes or acts differently than we do, it'll somehow compromise our faith. We would say, no. It doesn't compromise our faith. It reflects the very best of our faith when we move toward our other. Jesus embodied this all throughout the gospel narratives. Father Greg Boyle would say there's no us and them, there's only us, right? When we realize this distinction we have between us and them, those are just constructs that we're placing on one another, whether it's the immigrant or it's the theological other or the political other. There's only us. We are all we have. So let's get after it together, build restorative relationships that allow us to participate in God's restorative mission. I'll never forget spending the night in Casa del Migrante. It's a house of the migrant in Tijuana. It's one of the it's one of the many shelters in Tijuana that we partner with, and it's an incredible space. I consider it one of the most holy spaces I ever get to step foot on. This evening, I was spending the night there, and there was this was in 2018, so it was near when the migrant caravan was landing here. It was also lots of other immigrants from around the world that were coming through Tijuana seeking asylum. There were in that evening, there were people from the Middle East, there were people from Africa, people from Asia, Central America, South America, all under one roof. In a home fueled by the faith of a Jesus who always had his eye on the other, on the stranger. We're sharing meals. We're sleeping under the same roof. No one is checking us to make sure that that we qualify, that the boxes are checked. It was holy ground. It was like what the kingdom would look like. It gave us the gift of immersing into the broken reality so we could see the beauty that exists within all of us. On a trip soon after that, I met a mother fleeing from Guatemala. She was fleeing from the cartels, and her husband had been killed. She only had the capacity to take 2 of her kids, and she sat with us in this anguish. She had 4, and she had to leave 2 behind and take 2 with her, and sitting in that dissonance and that pain. It was only in immersing and getting close that I, a privileged white guy from the US, could understand the plight of my sister. Or Marisol, a mother who had also fled Central America. She is someone who had twins on her knees as we met with her at the Salvation Army, a women's home. for immigrants in Tijuana. She's bouncing her twins on her knees. She's describing her journey. I have twins myself, like you've seen. The connection in that moment, to understand in that moment, I could hear her story, weep with her, and drive 20 minutes back home with my blue passport, tuck my kids into sleep, live in relative security and comfort, and realize only in immersing do I realize I can't walk away from Marisol. I have to participate not only by praying with her and for her, but participate in the systems that are broken that are keeping her and her kids from a future of flourishing.
Jon, this is Bishop Susan. I'm just requesting that you slow down a bit for the interpreters. They have requested that you slow down just a bit.
You bet. I'm on it. Sorry about that. I get moving and then it's just it can go warp speed. Okay. So we talked about seeing. We are invited to see the humanity, the dignity, and the image of God in everyone. Everyday peacemakers are invited to immerse, to step off our roads of comfort and move into reality, to move towards conflict equipped with tools to heal rather than to win. What do we learn about ourselves and our broken systems when we immerse into the lives of our immigrant neighbors? I would argue it's those relationships that have allowed the Spirit to transform me more than any other relationships in my life. It's a gift to receive. The third practice I want to invite us into is contend. We see, we immerse, everyday peacemakers contend by standing in front of any bulldozer that's flattening people. We contend not by getting even, but getting creative in love. What bulldozers are flattening people? Immigration policies are flattening people. Mental illness is flattening people. Relational brokenness that's leading to anxiety is flattening people. COVID and an inability to access stimulus checks for many of our undocumented neighbors, that's flattening people. How are we, as everyday peacemakers, as followers of Jesus, contending for their flourishing, contending for our collective flourishing? This is the practice where we roll up our sleeves and we participate with God in making real what we see in God's rescue. We look at Jesus as a model of contending. Jesus was one who, again, entered into our conflicted story. How did God contend for us in Jesus? Not through military overthrow, but through suffering and selfless sacrifice. Not only turning the other cheek, walking the extra miles he talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, but ultimately in giving his life. He would give his life before taking the life of his other. He contends for us through suffering and selfless sacrifice. What would it look like for us to contend through our own suffering and selfless sacrifice? To get creative in love, not to get even. 2014, I was in Amman, Jordan. We were hosting a peacemakers retreat for peacemakers in the Middle East. And that was a moment the Syrian refugees especially were having to flee. At the time, the country of Jordan was 25% refugees. Here's a country who systemically said, we see you. We see the humanity in you, our neighbors. And we will restructure our whole society around allowing you to flourish. We will contend for you in costly ways. We're in a moment here in our country, richest country on earth, that's struggling to welcome 10,000 refugees a year. What would it mean for us to contend, not only personally in those relationships, but systemically? How do we leverage what's ours to change these systems? I saw some chatter in there about immigration policy 10 years ago that Yolanda was impacted by. This isn't going to shift overnight just because Biden was elected president. How are we contending with our lives and in our systems that allow us to live live as a reflection of the values we see in Matthew 25? We care for the prisoner, the foreigner, the hungry, the sick, Reality is, for us to contend, we don't need to go across the globe. We just need to have eyes to see what's right on our street. The globe has come to us. So how are we making our lives hyper local as participants in God's global restoration? One thing I think we've fallen victim to, especially as Christians in the US around contending, is we begin to see all of these issues like immigration as a project for us to fix. We can remain the heroes in the story rather than the participants and partners in the story. Our friend Samuel Perez, who's one of our colleagues with Global Immersion, he lives in Tijuana, he would say that we don't need your charity. We need your solidarity. We don't need your handouts. We don't need you to come down and just drop off your food goods, although that is holy and helpful. We need your relationships. Build relationships of solidarity with us so that we can link arms and do the work together. Yes, we need the food. Yes, we need the funding for our migrant shelters. Yes, we need support for our trauma care programs. Let's do it together. So how do we, especially those of us with privilege, not just hand out our charity, pick our next issue to become an expert on, to yell about on Facebook, to just send a donation and forget about? How do we actually build relationships where we're following the lead of the local community in relationship? For us organizationally, a big wake up for us was in 2018 when the migrant caravan moved through Mexico and landed in Tijuana, obviously starting in Central America. And we were on the phone and around the table with our colleagues in Tijuana immediately saying, what do we do together? How do we follow your lead to show up in a tangible way? And their response was, join us. Get as many people as you can from around the US to be with us, to stand with us, to pray with us, to work with us, to serve with us. And so collectively, collaboratively, we started an initiative we call the Borderlands Initiative, a binational initiative to support migrants in Tijuana, to build the capacity for churches in Tijuana to convert to shelters. Overnight, these churches in Tijuana were converting to shelters in 2018. At one point, we had over 150 people come, and we just said, you're coming not to say a single word, you're coming to listen and to follow the lead of the locals. We had a prayer service at the border at Friendship Park, binationally, north and south. You're going to hear from Seth Clark, who's a pastor with Border Church later, who was part of this. And in one voice, our hands raised, we're praying for a God who transcends every border and boundary, a kingdom that transcends every border and boundary, to be real here in this space. And then we went to shelters and we listened to the stories of migrants. We listened to Mexican leaders on how we can show up in constructive ways. To this day, the Borderlands Initiative is flourishing. The leadership of Mexican leadership, caring for migrants in need of trauma care, offering vocational support and tools. In this moment of COVID, and the asylum opportunities have completely dried up, it's creating healthy space for them to live in for the indefinite future. It's the gift of contending in solidarity rather than in charity. How might we contend in our own context? How might you contend in your own context? That's what it looks like for us here. But we all have to just discern, what does contending look like in your context? I can't prescribe that to you. That's the work that you do having seen and immersed. You must see and immerse before you contend, or else we just continue this posture of white supremacy, heroism, colonization rather than solidarity. We have an opportunity. The fourth practice, the final practice, and it's less a practice and more a celebration of God's reality, is what we call restore. Everyday peacemakers celebrate the big and the small ways that God is restoring our broken world. We don't do the restoration, God does, but we get to participate in that restoration as we see and immerse and contend. Jesus inaugurates this kingdom of God, right? We hear in Mark when Jesus says the kingdom of God is at hand. It can be translated as just waking up. Just wake up to the reality of God here. So much of restoration is just waking up to what God is doing and how we are participating in that. There's these mustard seeds of the kingdom that are sprouting all around us. How are they sprouting around you? And how do you have eyes to see them and celebrate them? That relationship that is mended, that system that is reformed, that family that is reunited. This is the fuel for our faith. This is the fuel for our practice. God is restoring. We need to mark it. We need to celebrate it. I'll never forget a refugee welcome event that we co-hosted here in San Diego. It's right after many refugees from the Middle East, specifically from Syria, had come to San Diego. And my kids, we're at Mission Beach. All 4 of our kids were there. And I had this picture of my 4 kids out in the ocean with kids from all over the Middle East who have been fleeing violence, playing in the water, laughing, splashing, imagining the wonder that God has for them. Understanding the uniquely different starting places and contexts we come from, and also seeing a glimpse of the dream that God has for us. I imagine the migrants who are experiencing healing from the trauma of loss and the tragedy of that 2-month journey they've taken that are happening through this Borderlands initiative. I think of those that are finding employment right now. It's reassigning them the dignity that was already inherent in them. You just heard from Yolanda, and you're going to later hear from Hector Barajas, who's with deported veterans. They have a story of restoration. When we first started meeting with Hector, a U.S. military veteran who was deported, there was no chance of him coming back with legal citizenship to the U.S. In 2018, I'll never forget embracing him in San Diego during his naturalization ceremony. Yolanda, the opportunity potentially of returning to the U.S. We're hoping, we're pleading, we're praying for restoration. I'll think forever of restoration in 3D when I think of our neighbor. She's an undocumented mother of 5 who's like a second mom to our kids, especially our twins. And a couple years ago, she was deported. A tragic moment of us in our neighborhood saying, how do we contend for this family? A father trying to now care for his 5 kids, a mother who's alone in Tijuana. It's a long story, but I'll never forget the knock on our door at 8:05 p.m. Our kids were in their jammies. It was the day after Mother's Day. And we opened the door, and it's this beautiful woman back at our doorstep. It was this feeling as if God had re-knit things back together the way they were intended to be. Relationships between mother and children, our neighborhood back with the fabric of someone who's so central to it. God was restoring and is restoring all that is broken. Dayoud Nasser is a Christian Palestinian. He says we can't pursue this restoration, this peace with others until we find peace in ourselves. How are we, everyday peacemakers, who are doing the work of coming to terms with our own brokenness, celebrating the fact that we have been reconciled to God so we can participate with God in restoring all that's broken? So friends, I want to ask us, are we willing to embark on this journey? This journey of understanding God's mission as restoration, and that our vocation is to be peacemakers who participate in it. Peacemakers who see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in everyone. Who immerse by stepping off our roads of comfort and into reality. Who contend not by getting even, but getting creative in love, as we see in Jesus' life and death. And in his resurrection, how do we celebrate restoration? Celebrate a resurrected God who is making all things new. Even when the world looks so glim and bleak, we trust, this is what faith looks like, that healing is possible. I want to offer a blessing. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Haley Mitsui, who's going to close us out with a prayer, a contemplative exercise as we move forward in our programming. So pray with me. May we see conflict not as a problem to fix, but as an opportunity for transformation. May we welcome the strangers among us and embrace them as neighbors. May we reject the paralysis of fear and be moved by our mandate to love. May we listen longer than feels comfortable and seek to understand rather than to be understood. May we be known by our invitation rather than our isolation. May we lean into deep relationships that transcend our borders and boundaries. And may we live as instruments of peace on any border that divides